We're going to talk about the food emergency, whether our food system is robust enough to deal with a crisis of climate change, a crisis of extreme weather. And to help us, we have three speakers. We have Ffinlo Costain, who is a person who has spoken at a number of occasions to parliamentary committees, to the European Parliament, and advised ministers and leadership teams in various countries across the world. So let's begin, first of all, by asking Ffinlo about the crisis itself. A report was recently published about the crisis, published by DEFRA and the Joint Intelligence Committee, which says we are facing a crisis in the very near future. And I'd like to start, Ffinlo, by asking you how important and significant you felt that report was.
Just before I kind of go into that, if I can just do a sort of quick introduction, just briefly, I apologize that because I don't know who people are and because it's on a Zoom, I can't sort of see reactions around the room. So I don't know the level of detail that you already know as an audience on this kind of thing. So forgive me if at some points I'm sort of trying to teach my grandmother to suck eggs. And also just to say hello to Ken Huggins, who is the parliamentary Green candidate for Dorset, which is North Dorset, where I live. So I've met Ken on occasions in the past. So I'm Ffinlo. I'm currently the editor of 8.9.com, which is the UK's land use news channel, and producer of the Farmgate podcast, which is the world's highest ranking food security podcast. And before that, as Francis sort of introduced, I've had, various different roles working with government, advising government and talking to different governments around the world on a range of different things. And food security has been part of that. Is this an important report? Yes, it is. Over the last 10 years in particular, I've done a lot of work trying to frame the conversation around climate change and nature and biodiversity as a national security issue. Very often it gets re-pigeonholed as food security. And as soon as people start talking about food security, they by and large mean getting rid of hedges, expanding fields, whacking fertilizer onto soil. And of course, that's not what I'm interested in. It's not what I mean by it. And what I've been trying to do is to sort of change that food security conversation by saying, well, let's look at food systems and food abundance and food scarcity and how that impacts on national security. In other words, if there were food collapses elsewhere in the world, what would happen? If that happened in sub-Saharan Africa, if it happened over swathes of Asia, what would happen? Obviously, those people would have to move because their land would no longer be able to support them. That would create an element of migration within those countries, within those continents that would lead to conflicts and potentially then further migration northward. So there's a whole range of knock-on impacts relating to that. This particular report is the first time that I've seen anybody from the security services really properly try and talk to government about what food and security actually means. So this particular report was called Global Biodiversity Loss, Ecosystem Collapse and National Security, a National Security Assessment. You'll see that I've put a couple of links into the chat. The third of those links is to a report that I wrote with a bunch of farmers and other policy people from around the world prior to COP26 in Glasgow, which was called Soil Health, the Security Threat Profile, which started to sort of try and look at these things. So far, when we've been looking at impacts on food systems, we've largely seen it through a climate mitigation lens. That climate mitigation lens has put an awful lot of emphasis on emissions and very often created distorting responses, leading to an intensification of systems where you can get more kilos of meat or dairy per kilo of CO2. And the argument that I've been making for a long time is that that is exactly wrong. We shouldn't be doing that. We need obviously to be very interested in emissions. We need to lower emissions, but we also have to have adaptation in mind. So it's mitigation and adaptation at once, at the same time as biodiversity loss. And to be clear, I mean, Francis said in his introduction that, were we going to see collapse? Were we going to see huge security threats as a result of climate change and ecological breakdown? Yes is the answer, but not because of those things per se, but because of human responses to those things. So how we as a society at a global level, at a local level, respond to these things. And I'm just going to hand back to Francis in just a second, but I'm just going to give you a couple of bits of flavor from this particular report. So it talks about, and it was a really crisp report. It's only about 12 pages long, and it couldn't have been clearer if it really tried hard. Global ecosystem degradation and collapse threaten UK national security and prosperity. Cascading risks of ecosystem degradation are likely to include geopolitical instability, economic insecurity, conflict, migration, and increased interstate competition for resources. Critical ecosystems that support global food production areas and global climate, water, and weather cycles are the most important for the UK's security. We're talking about reduced crop yields, a global reduction in arable land, fisheries collapse, changes to global weather patterns, even more releases of carbon from soil and various other ecosystems then being released to exacerbate climate change. More pandemics and zoonotic disease, etc., etc. So there's just a little bit of a flavour, and I'm sure I'll dip into it more as Francis asks another question.
The report itself is quite interesting because it says that if we don't address this problem, we're going to face a crisis, not in 10 years, not in 15 years, not in 20 years, but 5 years. So it's an imminent problem, isn't it? It's not one that is there out in the future. It's one that we face now.
Yes, and I mean, to be clear, we are already facing these problems. We are already encountering collapse of one kind or another. We've seen a 70% decrease in the number of insects. We know that soil health is a huge challenge, and that a lot of systems, food systems within the UK, particularly in arable and vegetables, are only being propped up because of the amount of fertilizer that's being shoved into them at the moment, rather than transitioning away into something more agroecological. And if we sort of go back to just before the Arab Spring, big collapse in the Russian harvest there, which meant that Russia closed its borders because it didn't want to export any of the wheat that it had grown. It's one of the largest wheat producing areas in the world, which meant that the global supply of wheat went down by about a third. And therefore, people in one or two of the Arab countries that, sort of fueled the Arab Spring, these were just about coping populations, reliant heavily on bread being just about an affordable staple. The price increases as a result of that harvest collapse then led to, protest, the price of bread increasing to protest, to then sort of conflict and ultimately war and revolution. So, these things are already happening, and they affect us directly as they occur because we are currently dependent on global commodities around the world. We import so much of the food that we eat ourselves or that we feed then to animals. An awful lot of our food system is reliant on these things. And so as soon as we start to see ecosystems collapsing, we start to see price pressures, we start to see increased competition for those resources. And we find that, the foods that we thought we could afford as a nation, suddenly we're unable to afford. And obviously we're a rich nation, so the knock-on for poorer nations is really very significant.
And it's not just a food crisis, is it? It's a water crisis. Some UN scientists have recently produced a report which says that in the future, and they used a stark term, in the future, if we don't deal with this, we could face water bankruptcy. So how important is it to face the water crisis as well as the food crisis?
Yes, it is. And I guess it sort of brings us a little bit towards solutions, because while there is an inevitability, I think, about collapse, there is a choice about the level of collapse and how quickly we then climb out of collapse. And water is absolutely critical. It's one of those issues in relation to climate change and biodiversity loss that has been underrepresented up until the last year or two. And so that report from the UN, alongside this report from the UK intelligence chiefs, really starts to turn the spotlight onto these things. And my own view and the view of a lot of people within the food system is that the only way that we can create food system resilience is to rethink the food system, to eliminate as far as possible those dependencies on external things, whether that's fertilizers or pesticides or machine parts or data or pharmaceuticals that come from China, whatever else these things are. We need to become more resilient ourselves. And what that means is reducing those inputs farm by farm, making those businesses stronger in themselves because they're less vulnerable to price fluctuations, and getting businesses into a position where they're able to produce food and climate mitigation and climate adaptation and biodiversity restoration, including soil health and water cycling as part of that. And of course, water, being a sort of plays a critical role, not just in terms of producing food, but the way that we hold water in the land, or the way that the land releases or fails to hold water, then leads, of course, to flooding and potential disease further downstream, and that sort of thing. And there is, I mean, in Dorset, where I live, there are months of the winter every year where if we want to get out of the village, we have to drive through hundreds of yards of water that's, several inches deep. And the only reason for that is because the land is managed poorly around those roads and the soil sponge isn't working. So you've got soil absorbing water into the first 2 or 3 inches, and after that it's waterlogged and the water just runs off. If you've got a functioning soil sponge, there's no reason why you shouldn't be going down a couple of feet, and in some instances a couple or 3 meters.
Sponge cities or sponge environments is an interesting topic, and we could almost do another webinar on that. But what about supply chains? I mean, supply chains, many people argue, are very fragile, they're just in time. And so if there's a crisis, we won't have food stored up, ready for emergency. How important is it to try and rearrange and restructure the supply chains we have in this country?
Yes, it does. And the question is where that reform comes from, because the likes of Tesco are unlikely to change their business model to favour the farmer or even to favour the customer. There is so much pressure from politicians, from the media, from the general public, from the retailers to keep prices as low as possible. And what we're starting to see is more and more farmers opting out of those supply chains, either selling direct or selling through cooperatives, selling in shorter supply chains. But for many of those farmers who would like to do that, the infrastructure simply isn't there. So I think there's only one abattoir in the country that deals with pigs, for example. So pigs are having to travel, right across the country before they are sort of taken to slaughter, which, in itself is a welfare challenge. But if you're trying to produce animals in an agroecological way, buy back the meat for your farm to be able to use and sell directly, then obviously that becomes impossible in that situation. So having
Yeah.
the infrastructure in place for food production at a local level, for fiber production at a local level, because of course 60% of the clothes that we wear are petrochemical, and that's all going to have to change as well. So things like leather, wool, cotton, flax, all those sorts of things are going to become very important in the future as well. So it's
And
about short supply chains and
um,
direct sales.
And of course, we're talking about national security here. So could you tell us a bit how you think food insecurity will impact on national security? Issues like mass migration, like food price rises, food shortages, cost of living increases, and even civil unrest and geopolitical conflicts. To what extent is national security in that way affected?
Yeah, and I think probably the way to address that is I mean, you've just outlined there, Francis, essentially what those security risks are, and the report from the intelligence chiefs does the same. It says these are very clear threats. If we're likely to see pandemics that sort of come in from other places in the world, other diseases. We're going to be doing a podcast in the near future about forests and animal and livestock and crop diseases, and the migration that's already taking place, from further south in the world as temperatures rise and those diseases come here, and ash dieback, for example, potential of sort of wiping out a huge part of the population of ash trees, and so these things are real, and the only way and I think therefore we need to think of these things in terms of defense. So if we're thinking about national security, then national security, usually we're thinking in terms of bullets and bombs, but it's about what is your stockpile? How do you defend yourself? How do you go on the attack? Well, if we're thinking about it in terms of food and land use, how do we defend ourselves? We make sure that our soil is functioning. We make sure that water is cycling, that the soil sponge is working, that biodiversity is able to support farm production. Nature is integrated within food and fiber production rather than relying on these things, these chemical inputs from elsewhere in the world. And so the first line of defense in any nation, in my view, is its farmers and its food system. And in the same way that that's true here, it's true in every other country of the world. And as I say, one of the first things that's likely to happen as a result of climate change and biodiversity loss is the collapse of food systems elsewhere, particularly when you have great big corporations and people like Bill Gates trying to sort of force Western models of agriculture onto large swathes of Africa and India and elsewhere in the world, very fertilizer heavy. And so that's, again, collapsing their ecosystems, it's collapsing their food systems, which makes that more vulnerable, again, leading to further collapse. And if I could
Okay.
just give you one quick anecdote before finishing, Francis, in terms of answering that sort of question quite directly, in terms of the Sahel. Um, 30, 40 years ago, the Sahel still had a cattle pastoralist approach to food production. It was fairly fertile. The type of approach to cattle management had been the same for hundreds of thousands of years, really. And then suddenly people around the world, from Australia and the US, started recognizing that they could get cattle from the Sahel for tuppence halfpenny as opposed to cattle from their own countries. And so that began a great global trade in cattle linked to the Sahel. The management systems didn't change, and so rapid desertification there, and that had a knock-on onto food systems. At which point, because many of the governments around the Sahel were not particularly stable governments, you then have terrorist groups like Boko Haram moving into those areas, effectively becoming the de facto government in a number of regions, delivering jobs and education and health and a whole range, but also controlling food systems. And so you're replacing quasi-democratic governance with terrorist governance instead. So that's a sort of a clear example of where just ecosystem collapse, food system collapse leads to very specific security issues. And I fear that that will happen here. The final thing to say, and I know you want to move on, there's so much to talk about and we've only got 10 minutes.
Let's open it up, shall we, to others as well, and then you can
Yeah.
maybe bring that in
So
there.
So just the final thing on that is that I went to a thing for a couple of days at Windsor Castle with Chatham House as part of that, looking at food security with a number of people from, sort of high up within the food policy and academia and corporations. And Tim Benson from Chatham House was there. He spent an hour basically saying very clearly, sort of a lot of the things that I've been talking about and much more. He said that Chatham House had been working to model how we could use business as usual to get how far we would get with that. And he said that everybody in Chatham House had worked really hard on this and they had failed with business as usual to get as far as 2050, that he thought that the UK society would collapse from 2040. And at the moment, we're just not seeing any movement away from business as usual.